At 1 a.m., my daughter collapsed at my front door, her lips split, her eyes swollen shut. She whispered through trembling breaths, "He hit me, Mom, because I caught him with her." My knees nearly gave out beneath me as I pulled her inside, cradling her face with shaking hands. Her hair was tangled, her dress torn, and I could still feel the cold of the night clinging to her skin. I want you to stick with me while I share this story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Evelyn Carter, late 50s, a woman who has lived enough to think she'd seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for the sight of my only daughter, Marissa, broken on my doorstep. She's 28, full of fire and independence, the kind of woman who laughs too loud and works too hard, but still believes in love. And then there's her husband, Brandon Hughes. 32, tall, sharp-dressed, the kind of man who can make a room believe he's trustworthy with just a smile. I never trusted that smile. I saw something hollow in it from the beginning, though no one else seemed to notice. I carried Marissa inside, laid her on the couch, and fetched a wet cloth to clean the blood from her mouth. She flinched when I touched her cheek, not from me, but from the memory of his fist. "You're safe here," I whispered, forcing my voice to stay steady even as rage churned inside me. "You'll never go back to him. Not if I have anything to do with it." Marissa's tears came in waves, her words broken between sobs. She had found Brandon at a hotel, half-dressed with some girl she didn't recognize. Chelsea, he called her. When Marissa demanded answers, he turned cruel in an instant, shoving her, spitting insults, then striking her across the face. "Pathetic," he'd said. "She understands me better than you ever could." Those words hurt her almost more than the blows. I listened, every detail burning itself into my mind. Brandon wasn't just a liar or a cheater. He was a coward who believed he could bruise my daughter and walk away untouched. He thought he was still in control. He thought Marissa would crawl back to him, ashamed, afraid, and too broken to fight. But he didn't know me. He didn't know that I was already piecing together what came next. I stroked Marissa's hair as she cried herself to sleep, but inside my chest something hardened. I wasn't just going to shield her. I was going to make sure Brandon Hughes paid for every single tear that fell onto my couch tonight. That was the moment the seed of revenge was planted. Quietly, deeply, and without mercy. The memory of their wedding still lingers like a bitter taste I can't wash away. White roses lined the aisle, a string quartet played softly, and everyone whispered about how lucky Marissa was to have found such a devoted man. Brandon stood there in his tailored suit, smiling like he owned the world, slipping a ring onto her finger with practiced ease. Guests clapped, tears rolled down cheeks, and I sat there pretending to smile while my stomach twisted. I noticed things no one else seemed to see. The way his eyes wandered even on that day, flicking toward the bridesmaids longer than appropriate. The firm grip on Marissa's arm when she leaned too far out of his pose for photos, as if her body was his property to adjust. The smooth way he charmed the waitstaff, his compliments dripping with something that wasn't admiration but ownership. He carried himself like a man already certain he could do whatever he pleased and still be adored. When I quietly voiced my unease later, Marissa only laughed, brushing it off with a sparkle in her eyes. "Mom, you're overthinking," she said. "Brandon adores me. He promised me forever." She wanted the fairy tale, the happily ever after she thought she had finally grasped. I didn't want to puncture her happiness, so I let my warnings die on my tongue. Looking back, that day feels like a stage play where everyone else bought into the illusion except me. Brandon's polished vows, his public kisses, the way he whispered promises loud enough for others to overhear. It was all performance. Behind the charm, I glimpsed a hunger for control, but Marissa only saw devotion. That blind trust made what came later so much crueler. She had built her life on a foundation of promises, never realizing they were hollow from the very start. Marissa sat at my kitchen table, her hands trembling as she tried to piece the words together. She said it started with the little things. Meetings that stretched late, phone calls he'd take outside, sudden weekend work trips that never quite added up. At first, she wanted to believe him, but her gut told her otherwise. So one evening, she followed. Her voice cracked as she described pulling into the parking lot of a hotel and spotting his car. Heart racing, she waited, hoping she was wrong. But then she saw him step out, not alone, but with a young woman on his arm. Chelsea Martin, 25, a coworker he'd once casually mentioned in passing. They walked inside laughing, his hand at the small of her back like Marissa's vows had never existed. By the time she confronted him in the hallway outside that room, her world was already collapsing. Instead of shame, he spat cruelty. His face twisted with rage, and he struck her, telling her she was nothing, that this girl understood him in ways Marissa never could. Those words cut deeper than the blow, leaving her hollow. She broke down in front of me, her sobs shaking the table between us. My own chest burned with fury so strong I could hardly breathe. I wanted to storm into that hotel myself and make him feel a fraction of the pain he had inflicted. But I forced myself to stay calm for her, to wrap my arms around her while my mind sharpened into resolve. I swore in that moment he would regret ever raising a hand to my daughter, and I meant every syllable. The knock on my door came just as the sun was rising. I opened it to find Brandon standing there, hair neatly combed, shirt pressed, as if appearances alone could wash away what he'd done. His expression was a practiced mix of pity and arrogance. He asked to see Marissa, his voice dripping with false remorse. When I told him she didn't want to speak to him, he leaned against the frame like he owned the place. "Evelyn, she's overreacting," he said smoothly. "You know how emotional she gets." I lost my temper, but she pushed me there. She made me do it. The way he twisted his words, painting himself as the victim, made bile rise in my throat. Marissa, fragile but listening from the hallway, froze at his tone. I saw her waver, guilt flickering in her eyes. That was his power, making her question her own reality. I stepped between them before he could sink his claws in deeper. "You don't get to rewrite what happened," I told him, my hand firm on the door. He smirked then, a flash of the control he thought he still had. "You'll regret turning her against me," he muttered, his voice low and sharp, before I slammed the door so hard the frame rattled. I stood there, heart pounding, knowing this wasn't over. If anything, his warning was a promise of what was coming. But I also knew he had just revealed his hand. From that morning on, I began watching, listening, and preparing. If Brandon thought intimidation would silence us, he had underestimated the wrong mother. I started quietly, the way you do when you know noise will alert a predator. I sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a list of questions, and I let my fingers do the searching. Bank statements, transaction histories, sudden withdrawals timed to his supposed overtime. Little red flags that, when threaded together, painted a picture I hadn't expected but should have guessed. Money that should have gone to rent and groceries was vanishing into unfamiliar accounts and lavish charges at places Marissa had never been. The trail widened. There were missed payments, bounced checks, and a pattern of desperate bets placed under a name that matched his online profiles. It didn't take long to see why. A gambling habit had eaten through what pride he had left, and he'd been covering it with lies and theft. Worse, there were signs he'd fudged expense reports at work and slipped company funds into his personal life. Fraud, if anyone cared to look. I didn't tell Marissa everything at once. She was raw, and shock makes people brittle. Instead, I reached out to someone I trusted. Lucas Bennett, an old friend of Marissa's with a quick legal mind and less patience for predators. When I explained the evidence, he didn't waste time with sympathy. He started drafting a plan. Divorce papers. Emergency protective orders. Civil claims to claw back anything that had been taken. He spoke like a surgeon, precise and cold, and I felt relief like the first breath after holding it underwater. We also mapped out a quieter route, contacting the bank with the records, speaking to HR at Brandon's office with photocopies of suspicious reimbursements, and lining up witnesses who'd seen him splurge when he claimed financial strain. Every document we compiled was another nail in the coffin of his lies. There was a small, ugly joy in methodical work, collecting proofs, filling folders, watching a man who believed his charm made him untouchable become cornered by paperwork and truth. I told myself I wasn't driven by vengeance alone, but by the need to make my daughter safe and whole again. Still, late at night, when the house was silent and I could hear my own pulse, I allowed myself to picture the collapse. His reputation shorn, his accounts frozen, the woman who hurt my child forced to account for what she accepted. That vision sustained me. Step by careful step, we began to dismantle the life he'd built on lies. The night of the dinner, Brandon played host with that same polished grin he'd worn since the day he joined our family. The table was set with candles, wine poured into glasses, his voice booming with stories meant to impress. He bragged about deals he had supposedly closed, vacations he was planning for Marissa, and the financial stability he claimed to provide. Relatives nodded along, charmed as always, some even congratulating him on being such a responsible husband. I waited until the plates were cleared and the room had settled into comfortable chatter. Then I slid a folder onto the table, its weight louder than any words I could have spoken. Brandon's laugh faltered when I opened it and began laying down the papers one by one. Withdrawal slips, screenshots, photos that needed no explanation. His accounts bleeding dry, his rendezvous with Chelsea, the messages that made a mockery of his vows. The silence that followed was heavy. You could feel the air shift, admiration draining from every face in the room. One of his cousins muttered a curse under his breath. His aunt looked away in disgust. Marissa sat frozen, but the relief in her eyes told me she no longer felt alone in the truth. Brandon's mask cracked. His jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. Then, in a flash of temper, he shoved his chair back so hard it toppled, the crash echoing through the dining room. For the first time, no one rushed to smooth things over. They all saw him as he truly was: volatile, arrogant, exposed. Chelsea, sitting across from him, had gone pale. When she saw the documents proving the lifestyle she'd been flaunting was built on deception, she pushed back her chair and left without a word, her heels clicking furiously down the hallway. Brandon called after her, but his voice broke, the confidence drained away. He stood there, stripped of his performance, surrounded by witnesses who would never again buy into his act. That was the night the pedestal he had built for himself splintered, and everyone at that table watched him fall. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and paper, a place where truth and lies are forced to wrestle under fluorescent lights. Marissa sat beside me, pale but steady, while Lucas organized files with calm precision. Brandon strolled in wearing an expensive suit he probably couldn't afford anymore, smirking like he thought the performance would still work here. When proceedings began, his lawyer spun a tale of misunderstanding. He claimed Brandon was a devoted husband driven to stress by financial burdens, that Marissa exaggerated what happened, that family interference had poisoned their marriage. It was all smoke, but he delivered it with confidence, as though confidence alone could bend reality. Then came our turn. Lucas laid out the timeline, each piece of evidence layered carefully. Bank withdrawals, fraudulent work expenses, testimony from neighbors who had heard shouting, and finally, the photographs of Marissa's bruises taken that awful night. My heart pounded as I spoke under oath, telling the court what I saw when she collapsed at my door, the fear in her voice, the way she shook as she recounted the assault. Brandon tried to interrupt, scoffing, shaking his head, whispering to his attorney. When he finally took the stand, he played the victim card, claiming Marissa provoked him, that he had been faithful, that she was conspiring with me to destroy him. His words only made him look smaller against the mountain of proof already on record. The judge listened patiently, then delivered a ruling that struck like a gavel against bone. Marissa was granted a clean break, divorce finalized, a restraining order firmly in place, and financial restitution ordered for the funds he had siphoned. His pleas for leniency went unanswered. As we walked out of the courtroom, I saw the truth settle over him like a shadow. The charm, the wealth, the family respect, all gone. What remained was just a man stripped of power, watching the pieces of his life scatter beyond his reach. It was weeks after the verdict when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. On the other end was a trembling voice I almost didn't place at first. It was Chelsea. She asked to meet in person, her tone stripped of the arrogance she once carried. Against my instincts, I agreed, and we sat across from each other in a small cafe, two women bound by the wreckage of the same man. Her hands shook as she admitted the truth. Brandon hadn't just lured her with promises, he'd cornered her with intimidation. He told her stories about Marissa, painting her as unstable, insisting he was trapped in a loveless marriage. When doubts crept in, he threatened her reputation at work, warning that no one would believe her if she tried to leave. What she thought was romance had been nothing more than a trap. I wanted to dismiss her pain, to remind her that she had chosen to be part of the betrayal. But as she spoke, I saw a familiar fear in her eyes, the same fear that once haunted my daughter. Brandon hadn't just deceived. He had controlled, manipulated, and silenced. Chelsea wasn't a partner in crime anymore. She was another casualty. Lucas agreed that her account could be powerful, especially if she was willing to put it on record. And she was. On the stand, her testimony was steady, recounting the threats and lies he had spun around her, the coercion that mirrored his treatment of Marissa. Hearing it from another voice cracked the last of his defenses. The image he had tried so hard to maintain collapsed entirely. For the first time, I watched him struggle without words, his usual performance unraveling in front of strangers who now saw him for what he truly was. Chelsea's choice to speak became the final stone that buried him deeper than any of us could have alone. I knew the court's ruling had gutted Brandon, but part of me wasn't satisfied. Men like him had a way of crawling back, slipping through cracks, finding new victims. I couldn't risk that, not for Marissa, not for anyone else. So I made sure his downfall was complete. Through an anonymous account, I delivered a neat package to his employer. Every suspicious reimbursement, every doctored receipt, every trace of company money that had vanished under his watch. I didn't need to embellish a thing. The numbers spoke for themselves. Within days, word spread that he'd been escorted out of the office with nothing but a cardboard box. No glowing reference, no second chance, just whispers of disgrace trailing behind him. But I didn't stop there. His gambling had left a paper trail longer than his lies, and I made sure it found its way into the hands of people he owed. Collectors who had been circling now knew exactly where to land their claws. Calls flooded his phone, letters stacked at his door, and his once polished life shrank to a corner filled with threats and desperation. I kept Marissa out of the details. She was healing, piecing her spirit back together, and she didn't need the weight of what I'd done. When she asked if he would try to come back, I gave her a steady smile and said, "No, sweetheart. He won't bother you again." She believed me, and that was enough. Behind that calm promise was the truth only I carried. Brandon Hughes had been erased from every path he once walked, and it was my hand that guided the erasure. Marissa started seeing a counselor, slowly unpacking the weight she had carried for too long. Some mornings were harder than others, but little by little her laughter returned, softer at first, then fuller, like sunlight finding its way back after a storm. I stayed close, driving her to sessions, cooking meals when she was too drained, reminding her she didn't have to walk through the wreckage alone. Watching her heal, I accepted a truth of my own. No matter how much I wished it, I couldn't erase the night she arrived at my door broken and afraid. Those marks would always be part of her story. But I could make sure the man who caused them never stood tall again. And I had. When Brandon Hughes laid a hand on my daughter, he wrote the end of his own story, and I was the one who made sure he lived it. Do you think I was right to destroy Brandon completely, or should I have stopped after the divorce? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like mine, don't forget to subscribe.